A lot of the armaments you see in World War I, Gatling guns, machine guns, what happens during World War I is that these become even more destructive.
As the echoes of the Second World War died out in 1945, thousands of weapons were seized from Germany as reparations for the damage they unleashed on the world. Distributed among the Allied forces, these guns, tanks, and warships became spoils of war and trophies owned by the victors. But what really happened behind the scenes, and where did these weapons eventually end up? Join us as we explore what really happened to the captured German weapons after the war. The disarmament of Germany. By the time Germany was defeated in 1945, it was regarded as one of the most powerful military forces in the world. The Nazis had a few weapons more advanced than the West. They had ammunition America hadn't invented yet, and their guns boasted more firepower. But as soon as World War II was over, they surrendered everything without resistance. To keep the Nazis from building up a resistance against the West, the Allies began the process of disarming Germany. Since Hitler was also dead at this point, morale was low. This, coupled with the fact that the Nazi army had been totally crushed, made the process more seamless than the post-World War I disarmament. Unlike Japan, Germany was also not allowed to govern itself in 1945. Instead, both its territories and the spoils of war were divided among the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and other nations in the Allied forces. Their goals were simple: destroy German military equipment, demobilize the armed forces, and undermine the industrial capacity needed to wage war. What happened to the rest of the equipment? There's no straight answer as to what really happened to the captured German weapons after the war. For one, many of the spoils of war were used for testing and analysis by the Allies. But for the most part, the weapons and equipment were reduced to scrap metal and melted to produce new products. Between 1945 and 1946, about 5,500 aircraft were dismantled for scraps at the Kingman Air Force Base in Arizona alone. Only a handful of these discarded Nazi weapons and hardware were ever used by other countries after the war. But while the United States and the United Kingdom managed to repurpose their war trophies, the Soviets preferred to hoard their portions. As a matter of fact, there are a handful of isolated fields and forests where you can still find old Nazi weapons and machinery wasting away. While some were previously damaged in battle, others were simply abandoned and forgotten. But whether they were reincorporated into the military force or sold for scraps, the purpose was still being fulfilled. You see, the main goal of the Allied forces was to make sure Germany wasn't able to bounce back immediately. By seizing all its resources and limiting its military ambitions, these nations managed to keep the world's biggest villain in check. It didn't matter what these nations did with the confiscated weapons. All that really mattered was that they were no longer in the hands of the Nazi regime. The French, for example, equipped a whole tank regiment with German panzers that were never used in the war. Because their own resources had also been depleted during the conflict, they needed time to pick up their production again. So these enemy weapons were used to defend their own people in the meantime. German PZ-4 tanks and Stug 3s even found their way into the Six-Day War in 1967. These were mostly used by Arab nations who purchased them at cheap prices, since they were confiscated resources. Sources even claim that Israel used a number of Nazi World War II weapons during its early days, although that has never been confirmed as hard fact. Since there were more than a few of these weapons out there, it wasn't surprising to find them in almost every military force of the time. The French army used the captured Panther tanks until about 1949, when they were replaced with ARL-44 heavy tanks. Even the Lebanese tapped into the market, purchasing some SM-79 bombers from Italy after the war ended. However, those quickly fell into disrepair and were deemed unusable. Newly liberated countries also got their share of the loot and quickly armed their armies with the leftovers. Those who were lucky got factory-fresh guns and ammunition. Others had to manage the worn-out piles from the field. Usually, the small arms were tossed to the side as scrap metal, along with the aged and worn-down pieces. Of course, many Nazi weapons were also lost in fields and rubble. Others were stolen by rogue soldiers. Then there's the fact that many German citizens kept a bulk of these weapons for themselves. You see, with Germany defeated, ordinary citizens began to panic. They knew their reputation had been destroyed on the global scale, and with no government of their own, citizens had to keep a gun or two close in case the Allies started to misuse their powers. The West, on the other hand, wasn't ready to live with an armed Germany. So they began a campaign to recover all weapons owned by civilians. It was a tough operation, hindered by many factors. But they managed to recover the vast majority of weapons owned or stolen by German civilians. Speaking of civilian use, Nazi items such as auxiliary ships, trucks, trains, and tractors were converted to more conventional use. Many were sold to actual civilians by the government, while some were distributed through unofficial channels. However, one major problem the Allies had to solve was what to do with the Nazi ships and vessels. U-boats, for example, posed a political problem. On one hand, the vast majority of the Allies wanted all of them destroyed. These Allies had more ships than they needed, and their shipbuilding capacity was in full swing. But on the other hand, some nations wanted the German U-boats for themselves for various reasons. A few of them wanted to incorporate them into their military. Others just wanted to study them and build their own versions using the Nazi versions as prototypes. At the end of the day, both sides had to reach a compromise, and hundreds of these U-boats were destroyed without remorse. As for the other maritime vessels, whichever was heavily damaged was sold for scraps. Some were destroyed immediately, while others were melted decades later. But why was everyone really keen on getting their hands on some German equipment? What was so special about them? Well, the truth lies in the ingenuity of the German engineers. Although they were cruel and sadistic warriors, the Germans knew a thing or two about building powerful military equipment. The Americans knew this, so instead of destroying all their allocations or abandoning them, they began shipping them to the United States. Or what better way to capitalize on your victory than to steal your enemy's secrets, right? Well, this strategy worked so well that it became part of the reasons America is still a world power today. But we'll get into that in a minute. Think of the AK-47, the most popular assault rifle in the world. Well, one of the reasons it's so popular is because thousands of AK-47s were made available following Germany's defeat. Many of these found their way to Africa, where insurgent groups and small resistance armies used them to wreak havoc on their people. But while the weapons were considered valuable spoils of war, the real treasure was the people who created them. And no one exploited that better than the United States of America. Operation Paperclip. While other nations were occupied with dividing Germany's possessions after the war, the United States was devising its own plans in secret. Or why would you take your enemy's guns when you can simply own the man who built that gun for your enemy? Enter Project Paperclip, a secret operation that many Americans don't know about, but became a very invaluable process in securing the nation's superiority. On paper, Project Paperclip, or Operation Paperclip, was America's way of helping the good Germans escape from their countries. The idea was to give the non-Nazi citizens a second chance at life, especially the brilliant and innovative ones among them. These included both German and Austrian engineers, scientists, and technicians. With help from the United States, these individuals were transported from their home country to the other side of the world, where they would begin a new life. However, the truth was far stranger than fiction. In reality, the operation was known as Project Overcast. And no, it wasn't about the people. Instead, America's goal was to secure the bright minds who really made Nazi Germany as powerful as it was, so America could build its arsenal. The official objective was to bring experts in all fields to the United States, for a period of 6 months or a year to help America in the war against Japan. But even after the war suddenly ended in August 1945, the program continued undisturbed. What started as a temporary advisory program quickly morphed into a pipeline for permanent immigration. So it appears the United States government was importing German citizens into its own country for its own benefit. But that's not even the most disturbing part. You see, while the US government managed to convince its citizens that these were the good Germans, that was very far from the truth. In reality, many of the scientists and engineers on Project Paperclip had Nazi backgrounds. According to reports, at least half of the first set that migrated to the United States were registered members of the Nazi Party. While many of them joined the movement to gain access to work opportunities, others really believed in the visions of Adolf Hitler. A few of them even had significant party records, being members of either the SS or the SA, also known as the Brown Shirts. Many Americans didn't know this, but the government did, and kept it hidden from the public for as long as possible. As for the Nazi scientists, this was a win-win. On one hand, they had managed to escape prosecution, as they were now being protected by the United States. On the other hand, their past was easily swept under the rug, and they got a new life, as well as a more noble profession. Of course, many American officials spoke against this operation, claiming that America was trying to help its enemies avoid accountability. However, the counter-argument was that we needed their knowledge, or at least we had to keep them for ourselves, or else the Soviets would offer them the same incentives. Considering how America and the Soviet Union quickly turned on each other after defeating Germany, that would have been a disaster. One famous scientist who migrated to the US through this pipeline was Dr. Wernher von Braun. In case you don't know who that is, he's the man who led the development of the V-2 ballistic missile. Well, what most people didn't know was that von Braun was an open member of the Nazi Party. Even more, he was an officer in the SS and was involved in the exploitation and murder of Jewish war prisoners. Many of the Nazi missiles built under his command were done using slave laborers. But the United States Army managed to keep that information classified, while bringing von Braun and about 125 of his friends over to Fort Bliss, outside El Paso. Together, these men helped the US government build and launch the V-2 missiles. In addition, they also played a key role in the development of the cruise missile. Later in 1950, von Braun and his group were moved to Alabama to help with the nuclear ballistic missile project. But that's not even the craziest part. After the Soviet Union launched the Sputnik satellite in October 1957, von Braun and his men stepped up to help America win the space race. It was all thanks to their efforts that the United States eventually launched its first satellite the following year. He also played a key role in the development of the Saturn rockets that sent Americans to the moon in 1969. But while their impact in this field was undeniable, von Braun's group only contained about 15 to 20% of all the German scientists that made it to America. The vast majority found their home in the Air Force. Others were sent to the Navy, while some even got hired by private companies. On the surface, it may appear like an alliance with the enemy. But looking back at the impact of this movement, it's safe to say it was a good idea. While many Americans believe that von Braun's group were originally brought in to help with the space race, that wasn't exactly true. The truth was that they were here to help us develop weapons in the ongoing arms race. Many world powers were building rockets, jet engines, and advanced missiles that could wipe out small cities. The United States didn't want to find itself at a disadvantage, so the Germans were brought in to share their extended knowledge about the field. Of course, with or without the help of von Braun and his men, America still had a formidable arsenal, but it would be unfair to deny their impact in the grand scheme of things. Was this enough reason to excuse their Nazi past, though? We'll leave that for you to decide. Soviets and the spoils of war. In the dark days of the Second World War, Germany lost many of its most valuable weapons and military hardware every time it suffered defeat. While this was a common problem for every nation involved in the war, Germany's losses were quite significant. Because of how expensive these equipment were, many armies preferred to recover and reuse all enemy equipment that fell into their hands. Over time, using enemy weapons became commonplace on the battlefield, especially among the Soviet troops. These Nazi equipment includes submachine guns, like the MP-40s, and other heavy artillery weapons. After the Battle of Stalingrad in 1943, hundreds of German tanks were captured by the Red Army. This includes the Panzer III tanks, as well as the Stu-G III armored units. Many of these tanks were damaged at the time, so the Red Army engineers began working on repairing and reusing them. This strategy would later be employed by the entire Soviet Union after the war ended. In total, over 100 tanks were re-engineered as the Su-76I self-propelled gun. Others also served as the prototype for the Soviet SG-122 self-propelled howitzer. Apart from the Panzer and Stu-G, the Soviets also captured about 100 ex-German Panzer IV medium tanks. But not every tank recovered by the Soviets was used by the army. Some, like the Tiger I and Tiger II tanks, were only used for testing rather than fighting. By capturing Nazi equipment, the Soviets managed to gain valuable intelligence on the capabilities and weaknesses of the Germans. These tanks were also used in so-called deception operations. In such cases, German tanks would often lead the attack against the Axis forces. The idea was to trick the enemy into recognizing a friendly tank before launching a surprise attack and decimating their forces. In other cases, the tanks were rearmed with better Soviet weapons, like the Panzer I tanks that got outfitted with Soviet 20mm Schwach cannons. The second chance. While the Americans were transporting hundreds of Nazi scientists overseas, the Soviets also decided to create their own export system. In total, about 2,500 former Nazi engineers, technicians, and scientists were selected from the occupation zone of Germany and Berlin. They, along with 4,000 family members, were transported from their home nation to the Soviet Union. The story began on the morning of October 22, 1946, with a man named Ivan Serov. At the time, Serov was the head of the Soviet military administration in Germany. It was his assigned armed forces that organized the selection and transportation of these scientists and their families by rail, all the way to the USSR. Much of their equipment was also moved, so as to aid the continuation of their research work in the new territory. The codename Osoaviakim was derived from an organization of the same name, which helped recruit civilians into the Red Army during the war. The idea behind the operation was to transplant foreign specialists into the territories of the USSR. But unlike the American version, many of these men were not given official employment or proper documentation. In some cases, their families were even left behind in Germany, while the scientists migrated alone to their new home. It's also worth noting that this operation was much larger in scale than Operation Paperclip. It was also treated with more secrecy, so very few people even knew what was happening. But at the end of the day, this was all considered proper preparation to be paid by the German government. You see, at the end of the World War, the Soviet Union had suffered great losses from Nazi Germany. About 27 million people had died. 1,700 cities had been destroyed, and food production was so low that it could even be compared to a famine. To demand some payback from Germany, several world leaders met in February 1945. The meeting, known as the Yalta Conference, featured prominent figures like Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin. At the end of the meeting, Germany was slammed with a fine of $20 billion. 50% of this went to the Soviet Union, since they suffered the most damage during the war. The distribution of the resources was also based on the contributions made by each party to the war effort, how many men were lost on their sides, and their role in defeating Germany. This fine was payable through surrendering equipment, monetary compensation, and even human labor. Because of this, the Soviets, United States, and even France and Britain chose to seize the intellectual assets of Nazi Germany. This was why it was legal to force their scientists to divulge their research findings and discoveries. Initially, the Soviets set up design offices in the occupation zones. Here, the scientists were brought in to reconstruct the Nazis' guided missiles. Operation Osoaviakim was later launched by national decree on May 13, 1946, by the Council of Ministers of the Soviet Union. According to documents, the objective was to transfer the construction bureaus as well as 2,000 German specialists by the end of 1946. Ivan Serov, the head of the Soviet military administration in Germany, was selected for this assignment. The goal set by the Soviet Union was multifaceted. First, they needed the scientists to help build their own weapons. This was a crucial step in rebuilding the Soviet Union. Then they also needed their help in dismantling all production facilities belonging to Nazi Germany. This was because Germany was banned from developing and manufacturing weapons at the time. So it was important to decommission all the facilities used by the Nazis during the Second World War. What made the Soviets' operation even more disturbing was how quickly things moved. Within just half a day, former Nazi employees were drafted and transported using 92 freight trains. Many of them had no say in this decision, so they couldn't even decline the invitation. Some, like this unidentified specialist from Dessau, managed to escape hours before the officials arrived at his home. Unfortunately, since the telephone network had been shut down, he couldn't warn his colleagues. Another designer at Zeiss reportedly suffered a heart attack when he found out he got drafted. At first, experimental design offices were set up in the occupied zones, and these men were forced to work there. These facilities would later develop into actual companies, like the Central Works or Zentralwerke, located in Bleicherode. But because this violated the agreement to not produce weapons in Germany, the Soviets decided to move the men and equipment to the motherland. Some of the men transported during this operation include Hugo Schmeisser. He was an arms designer for the Nazis who developed the STG-44, the first successful assault rifle. Werner Gruner, another arms designer, was also drafted. In his glory days, he helped the Nazis create the MG-42, one of their most effective all-purpose machine guns. A physical chemist named Karl Hermann Geib was also drafted by the Soviets. During the war, he managed to develop the Girdler sulfide process used in producing heavy water. Many of these scientists were forced to work for the Soviet Union, and with their help, these nations became more and more powerful. It was all thanks to them that the Soviets developed their own versions of the atomic bomb, as well as other military equipment. Fate of the warships. After seizing a large portion of Germany's maritime fleet, the Allies still had to figure out what to do with them. As stated earlier, many were chopped up and sold for scraps. Some were melted down to form raw materials for new products. Others were sent to the bottom of the ocean, where they still remain till today. But that's not the whole story. In 1946, the United States had a very brilliant idea which many of the Allies would later adopt. Instead of simply sinking these ships intentionally, why not use them as test materials for their experiments? This was the birth of Operation Crossroads. It was a man named Louis Strauss who first presented the idea to the government. In an internal memo to Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, Strauss suggested that the United States use the enemy warship at its disposal to simulate a real battlefield scenario. Since the United States had never used a nuclear weapon in maritime combat, this sounded like a good idea. But with very few bombs left in the arsenal, he suggested that the targets should be dispersed over a large area. This way, the Navy would know how best to handle their next big bomb drop if it happened in the middle of the sea. Not surprisingly, his idea was accepted. On July 1, 1946, The first test was conducted in the Marshall Islands. It was called Operation Able. The bomb, named Gilda, was dropped from the B-29 Superfortress Dave's Dream of the 509th Bombardment Group. The Nazi ships were scattered around the drop area and all were decimated by the bomb. The second bomb, named Helen of Bikini, was dropped on July 25, 1946. By the time the operation was over, almost all Nazi ships now belonging to the United States had been destroyed. In addition, the US also got a few submarines as part of the reparations. Some were studied by engineers and scientists and rebuilt the American way. Others were also scrapped and melted to serve as raw materials. As for the missiles and bombs obtained from the Nazis, they remained in the arsenal of the United States for a while. Some served as inspiration for the design and invention of new bombs. Others were kept as war trophies and symbols of superiority. Chemical weapons were also disposed of in the ocean, despite the risk they posed to marine life. Since the US also owned its own advanced weapons, very few equipment were eventually moved from Germany. Because the cost of transporting them was extra high, it didn't make sense to take what they already had. Before their eventual surrender, the Nazis also buried many weapons in the ground throughout Germany and in occupied territories. The idea was that whenever a revolution was ignited, the future Nazis could dig these spots and find enough ammunition to overthrow the Allies once again. This turned out to be a mere fever dream. Today, many of these weapons and ammunition remain buried underground, with many treasure hunters seeking them out all across Germany. On many occasions, ordinary citizens have stumbled on bombs and guns while digging in their homes, all remnants of the bygone Nazi era. So while the Allies took the majority of these war equipment, no one can really tell how much still remains buried within the ground itself. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.